I guess we'll start by just noting how good the summer series was this year and how much I enjoyed all of the different speakers. And I didn't get to be in the classes that we were having on Sundays, but I know the material that we were covering. And I hope that was as beneficial to you all as it was to me, just getting to read through the material. I really enjoy the summer series that we have. It takes a lot of work from many people to put that on and to coordinate everything and to line up teachers. And it's a good opportunity, I think, on Sunday mornings in particular to showcase and to encourage the teaching abilities that the men of the church here have. And it is a blessing to be in a place where there are so many capable teachers and in the adult classes and also in the children's classes. So the whole church is involved in that effort. And I was just really happy with the summer and how everything went. It was wonderful. Having said that, I'm glad to be back teaching in here again with you all. And we're going to cover a couple of my favorite books in the New Testament. And I pretty much say that about every book that we ever study. But one of the reasons that I enjoy the Thessalonian letters is because they don't get talked about very often. And it helps us, I really think reading through and studying 1st and 2nd Thessalonians helps us to get a feel for the pulse of Christianity in the first century. As the church is spreading and it's going into these new regions, some of the things that you would see people struggling with, some of the ideas or concepts that people are going to wrestle with as they're trying to find their faith, as they're growing in their faith, and as the gospel is being preached, some of the opposition and some of the problems that the gospel is going to run into, that the church is going to run into, that individual Christians will run into. And we need to prepare ourselves for the same sorts of things. Because when we start looking at the ancient world and we start looking at the modern world, there's one thing that one of my history teachers used to say, is that history never repeats itself. The dates are always different, the times are always different, the names are always different, and the places are always different. History never repeats itself, but people do. People make the same mistakes. People say the same things. People do the same things. And so there's this sense in which when you're just talking about the story of humanity, you're going to see these patterns because people are always doing the same things because people don't change. And so it was kind of an interesting way to focus on the real issue, is it's not that history repeats itself, it's that we don't learn from our own mistakes is the problem. That we as a group, humanity, we just don't learn from our own mistakes. And that's what we're going to see in the New Testament. We're going to see the same things that we're facing today. So just sort of as a way of introduction, what do we know? Like collectively here together this morning, what do we know about ancient Greco-Roman culture? Like what are some things that you have heard or some things that you have read about the culture that Christianity is marching into? That's absolutely one element of it. There's an element of the culture that is very, I don't want, maybe selfish is a good word, like hedonistic, maybe another word, the idea of I know I'm mortal and I'm going to get as much enjoyment out of life as I can while I can. And there's a sense in which that's not bad. Right, that's kind of like the message of Ecclesiastes, right? You've got this youth. You should enjoy it you should enjoy your health while you're healthy. You should enjoy your strength while you're strong. And with the mindset in Ecclesiastes that all of this is governed by a fear of God. But sometimes you see in the ancient world where they get the idea that, yeah, we're mortal, but that whole governed by the fear of God is absent, and so it goes off the rails. So yeah, that's definitely going to be part of the culture. I think we've talked before about the Greek drinking parties. I won't sicken you all with those details again, but that's sort of the idea. What was that? Yeah, they have a pantheon of gods, many, many, many gods. One of my favorite buildings in Rome is actually the Pantheon. And not not because I like the gods. Here is Roman culture, kind of in a nutshell. And depending on the gods you worshipped, depended on the level of devotion. There were certain gods that you were really devoted to, and there were other gods that you just kind of recognized because you didn't want to get in trouble with them. And so it sort of governs the culture. And this pantheon really wasn't seen as an individual choice. Right? You don't get to choose whether or not you worship Roma. Right? If you're not willing to worship Roma, then you are an enemy of the state. Because that's what makes Rome successful, is their obligation and their worship to this pantheon. That's how Rome is successful. What were you going to say?
That's what I was going to say, but the same thing, but just the Roman Empire, the rule of the empire allows people.
Yeah, it's an empire. If you're like me, you tend to read back into history and think that most people in history have lives very similar to yours. And when we read about the Christians in Corinth, for example, you picture them maybe sitting around. Either you have like the Hollywood version in your brain where everybody's sitting around in togas, reclining in fancy chairs, or you have what we tend to do as humans, you just read your time back into history. Like the medieval paintings of biblical events. It's funny to go and look at medieval paintings. Guess how the people in first century Palestine dressed according to the medieval painters? Exactly like the medieval painters dressed, right? And so it's one of those things where we kind of tend to read our culture back into things. As Republican as the Romans liked to think they were, there were always sort of elements of oligarchy and eventually empire governing their country. And so there is this sense, or their nation, or whatever term you want to use. In the first century, there is a king, and the king's reign is absolute. They are divine, and once they die, they will be deified. And disobeying or standing against the emperor is to stand against the gods. And so it not only was an affront to the government, it was an affront to religion, and it is absolutely unacceptable on any level. And so it helps us to understand when you get to the trial of Jesus, and the Jews are saying, we have no king but Caesar. That's a very politically charged statement. It's a religiously charged statement, but it's also very politically charged, because that's the idea, right? There is no king but Caesar. And so Jesus claimed to be a king. And that is going to be an issue that comes up again and again and again throughout the history of Christianity while the Roman Empire is in power. What else do we know? Yes. Yes. The power is concentrated, very much so, in people who are unlike Jesus. It is not a godly empire. The rulers are not what we would describe as godly people. It doesn't necessarily mean that they were pirates, but it does mean that they weren't godly in the descriptions that you see in the text of Scripture. And so it was possible to be an upstanding Roman citizen, but at the same time, from the scriptural perspective, be a very ungodly person. Just like today, right, you might have people in your community who are upstanding, they're viewed as upstanding citizens, but if you were to compare to Scripture, they would be ungodly individuals. And that's one of the difficulties that we will have as believers, is we use a different set of standards. We're not judging things the way that the world judges. We don't judge according to appearance. We don't judge according to the predominant winds or thoughts. We judge according to what God has shown us. That's the goal, at least. And the powers in the first century, ordained by God, were ungodly. What else do we know? Is the empire uniform? Or is it? Yeah, no is the answer. But uniformity was the goal. Sort of like the United States, right? There are supposed to be 50 states. And everywhere else in the world, the word state refers to sovereign nation. But you come over here and we use the word state, and it's almost like a county in other places, the way that those words are used. And what we have here, if you go back and look at sort of the overriding thoughts when they're framing our country, it's almost like you have 50, well, at that time it's not 50, but you have independent nations that are confederated, right? They're linked together through a government that is going to allow them to pool resources for things like defense. And that's sort of the idea. They realized that, North Carolina as its own nation would eventually fall to an external power like Great Britain, and so they decided to link themselves together federally eventually. And so what we're supposed to have are 50 almost nations linked together by a federal government for the purpose of things like commerce and defense. Rome kind of did the same thing. Right? So it's a very old idea, actually. Rome has these various provinces scattered throughout, and you can't erase the different identities of these provincial governments, but you can really, really try. You can give people money as they conform, very much like if the federal government wants your speed limits to be 65 miles an hour, what do? Yeah, they withhold money from you, your highway money, if you won't conform. And they do that with everything. The drinking age is usually 21 in most states because that's what the federal government wants. And so they just withhold funding if your laws don't match the laws they want. And so you kind of coerce uniformity. And that's what Rome did. If you were very loyal to Rome, if you were adopting and conforming to Roman ideas and customs, then Rome made you a favored city. Maybe they would give you tax-free status for a little while. They would do these things to sort of bring uniformity in. But overall, just like today in the States, how if you go to a foreign country, like if you go to Germany and order unsweet iced tea, the waiter is probably going to go, "Are you from Texas?" Because it's sort of like a regional thing, right? It's colloquial. And just like, and then they ask, well, where is your cowboy hat? Right? It's the next question. They expect certain behaviors because you just know that regions have different personalities. Local churches have different personalities. Anytime you get a group of people together, you wind up with sort of a personality of the group. And that's going to be very true. And so Thessaloniki, the name for what we would call Thessalonica today, is going to have a very distinct personality from other places. There will be some things that are uniform, but also some things that are a little bit different. What else do we know?
At this point, Rome is still growing. Rome is still actively acquiring new territory, so it's strong, it's optimistic.
Yeah. Rome is still growing. They're acquiring new territories. They're actively engaged in military campaigns of expansion. The overall view of the empire is optimistic. It doesn't seem like it's going anywhere. That's one of the, it's a benefit and it's a detriment of reading history, is when you come to the first century and they're talking about moving forward and doing all these things, you've got like 150 years left before you're on the downward spiral. I know how this story ends, right? Like today, when you look at the United States, generally, despite what you hear in the news media, I don't really see the United States going anywhere in the next 100 years or so. I mean, I could be horribly wrong. I mean, next week it might just all come, catastrophically falling down. But outside of some really, really unforeseen event, I expect the United States to be here for quite a while. And so that's sort of what you've got, is this really optimistic sense of empire. And so when people face opposition, there's not a lot of hesitancy. Rome can do anything, and they're going to do it. And so if you oppose them, they will just destroy you. Now, having said that, active persecution against Christianity in the first century, there's not much. Like state-sanctioned persecution. There's not much. Now, is state-sanctioned persecution the only kind? No. In fact, sometimes the non-state sanctioned persecution can almost be worse. Because what you have are officials who will just look the other way. Right? And people who are being persecuted, you're supposed to be protected, but when you go and appeal to the governing officials, they're like, we have nothing to do with this. This is outside of our realm of jurisdiction. And you sort of see that when you read through Acts. There will be times where they come to Roman governors, and the Roman governor will be like, this is a matter of your religious law. Go discuss this someplace else. We're not putting up with this. And if that's the answer you get in Rome, there's really no appeal process. You don't get to appeal to the next judge unless you happen to be a Roman citizen. So in this sense of expanding empire, there's also a very sharp contrast in the way that people get treated. If you're a citizen, you have rights. If you're not a citizen, you don't. There are no basic human fundamental rights granted to people if you're not a Roman citizen. Now, if you are a citizen, there's all sorts of privileges that you have, but if you don't, then you have none of them. It's estimated that at this time, about 40% of the empire are slaves. Just to give you an idea. Now, not all slavery was the same in the Roman Empire, but about 40% of the population is slaves. Most of the population lives in what we would call poverty, and very, very few people are wealthy. And so Hollywood, and every time you look back at Hollywood, they show you there's all these lavish palaces, and it looks like everybody in Rome just has these massive homes, and they're all reclining and being fed grapes, when the reality is that most Romans ate once or twice a day. They had bread, cheese, and maybe a little bit of oil, and they were very poor. You lived day to day, generally speaking, in the Roman Empire. And so this is sort of the general things that are going on. Some more specific things about Thessaloniki. It is the capital of Macedonia. And Macedonia, anyway, there's a cool picture that Ryan Firm found of some of the ruins there in Thessaloniki. It's the capital of Macedonia, and it was an important city. It was important because of its location. It was important because it's a central area for the politics in the region. And the region, Macedonia, is culturally significant because that's where Alexander is from. And really, more importantly, that's where Philip is from, his father. And so you've got this movement of Greek culture out of Macedonia, although the Athenians would have argued the Macedonians weren't really Greek. And Rome will then come in, and Macedon sort of becomes the center of the Roman expansion out toward the Levant and out toward the east. So Thessaloniki is a very important city. The city is governed locally. One of the unique things about Thessalonica, because it's really important, and because Rome wanted to be on very good relations with that area, it was governed locally. Right? There wasn't a Roman procurator or a Roman governor that gets inserted into the politics. The local people are allowed to choose their leaders. That's not common. Now, because you've been granted this special privilege, you will defend it. And you will do anything that is necessary in order to protect your local governance. Like, imagine if the federal government were to come to Brentwood or Nashville and say, we're going to take your mayor out and we're going to put in a mayor that we have chosen for you. How would you feel about that? You're like, wait. Hang on. Why? Well, we don't like some of the things that you've been doing. Give us a list and we'll fix it. Right? There's like this gut reaction that this can't be good, and we will do anything we can to fix it. That is going to come into play in the history of the church in Thessalonica. Local culture is going to be, like we were talking about, centered around this pantheon of gods. They have all the standard gods that are going to be worshipped there. Archaeologists have found shrines dedicated to many different gods. They have a temple in Thessalonica to the cult of the emperor and to the cult of the goddess Roma. Pretty standard in most big cities to have those things present. That's sort of how you gained good graces with the emperor. If he knew that you were worshiping him on a daily basis, he tended to be happy with you. Just like most people probably would be if you're like, I worship you. They're like, oh, well, that's nice. Have a present. Right? That's sort of the way that it worked. And so this is a really important temple. It's a really important process of worshiping the emperor and Rome itself personified as the goddess Roma. And The Thessalonians were very devoted to that worship, not necessarily because they believed it, but because it protected their local customs. There are some mystery cults. And when you hear the word mystery cult, what do you think? Yeah, that's basically what it is. It's a secret society. The word cult just means like religion, but it's sort of like, somebody once said the difference between a cult and a religion is popularity. I don't know how true that is, but it's a religion, right? It's a secret society, and the reason why they get called mystery religions, one of the reasons why, is because there's like insider information that you only get to know once you join. Right? It's not a mystery in the sense of highlighting that this is hidden. It's highlighting the fact that once you join, it will be revealed to you, right? You'll get to know the secrets. Christianity, I'll just tell you right now, biblical Christianity has no secrets, right? There are secret things that God knows, but as far as like we as believers, you don't have to reach a certain initiation level before we tell you what we really believe. Right? In any group, if you ever encounter them and there's like secret rites that you have to earn the privilege to know, run away. Right? Because that's not good. There are no secret rights and privileges as far as believers are concerned. You want to be a Christian, I'll tell you everything that it's about that I know, right? That I know. I can't tell you what God is thinking other than what He's revealed in Scripture. But as far as like what do Christians believe, what do Christians do, why do we do it, what is our hope, we can just talk about that. So there are mystery cults here, quite popular in the first century throughout the Roman Empire. Some of them are empire-wide, and when Christianity begins, most people think that Christianity is just another one of these mystery cults. Because the Christians did meet together. They would have what we would call today closed communion. In other words, they weren't like inviting the public to come to their worship services. But if you came, they weren't going to turn you away. We know that by the 2nd century or so, that the Lord's Supper wasn't offered publicly. Like if you come to the worship service, the Lord's Supper is for believers. Now what they did in the 1st century, I don't know. That's never really addressed in Scripture. I don't know how they handled that. But by the 2nd century, the Lord's Supper is for a believer. We're not going to not tell you about it, but you can't do it with us unless you're a believer. So Christianity sort of gets labeled as one of these mystery cults. One of the more prominent ones in Thessalonica is the cult of Chabrios. Let's talk about that for just a second. Chabrios is a king who was murdered by his brothers. All right, I mean, that sounds vaguely familiar if you're a Christian. Chabrios was a king who was murdered by his brothers, but after his murder, he transcended to the divine realms, and one day he would return from those divine realms, and he would begin his kingdom anew, and he would reign forever. Does that sound familiar? I mean, it should, right? There is this desire throughout human history, to have a good king reign over us. It doesn't matter what time and period you go to. People might use different language to describe it, but everybody wants the good ruler to come and make things right. If you can read through the Republic, and there's this idea of having this Superman, I guess that's Nietzsche's word, but having this Superman lead who is always going to do the right thing and always make the right decisions, somebody that you can just put your trust in intrinsically. And so you sort of see this throughout human history. And here is this desire to have death overcome and to have the good ruler come and fix things forever. When the Christians get to Thessaloniki and they run into people who are members of this cult, which is kind of popular in Thessalonica, what do you think they told them? Yeah.
Yeah, because that's a challenge we face. Now, I don't know the answer to your first question.
Yeah. Well, we don't have any of the text, right? It would be really helpful if Epaphras or Paul or any, Timothy, Silas, any of these people who are going around teaching, if they would have like left notes and said, when I ran into the cult of this person, this is how I evangelized, But probably what they did, when you get into the extra biblical writings of believers, they would talk about things like plundering Egypt to clothe Jerusalem. And the idea is you go into these cultures and you take the things that they get right and you highlight those, or you draw them out, or the desires that they have that are good desires, you draw those things out and you show them how God fulfills those desires in a better way maybe than they ever imagined. And so here it's like these people are ripe for hearing the gospel. They want this king to come back. But really, nobody knows, like historians, archaeologists, we don't know much about this cult outside of the pictures that we have. There's no religious text. There's not a lot of information about it. It was very localized to Thessalonica. And so you've got these people coming in saying, hey, you've got the right idea. You've got a really good idea. You've just got the wrong details. Let's sort of flesh these details out and show you how this is like a global thing, right? So your idea is really good. You're just thinking too small. This is what the God who created everything was always going to do. And your desire for this king to come back and reign eternally, man, that's a great desire. Let's talk about that. And so I don't know exactly how they preached Jesus to these people. Wow, if you run into somebody who believes that there is a king who is murdered but transcended to the divine realms and is going to come back one day and rule forever, you should probably talk to that person about Jesus, right? I mean, that's a pretty good starting point. So the gospel, let's go over very, very briefly with some of the time we've got left to Acts 17. And let's look at when the church in Thessalonica starts. Sometimes I'll say Thessaloniki. By force of habit, it's the same place. So in Acts 17, this is where we're going to see Paul and Silas going through the region. We'll just read a few verses and then we'll talk about what's going on. Now when they had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews. Paul went in, as was his custom, and on 3 Sabbath days he reasoned with them from the Scriptures, explaining and proving that it was necessary for the Christ to suffer, to rise from the dead, saying, this Jesus who I proclaim to you is the Christ. Okay. What are some questions we have about that? What are some things you notice?
He's only there for a very short period of time before he establishes the church.
Yeah. 3 weeks? That's not long. What does he talk about?
He's talking about everything that happened in the past did not happen by accident. It was planned from the beginning. Christ had to suffer. In his blood is what it said.
Yeah. And this idea that everything that happened in the past happened on purpose, and it is Christ's suffering, his death on the cross, that is going to bring about our justification, especially through his resurrection. The details that you get here, now knowing that you have this cult of Cabrios in Thessalonica. Now, I don't think that Paul would have preached anything different in any other place, but when he talks about this king, this Messiah, who is going to suffer and rise from the dead, now that has a slightly different power to it if you're Thessalonian. Because you're like, hey, wait a minute. That's our story. Right? Well, really, no. That's God's story. God is the one who wrote it first. You've just sort of figured that much out. That this is the only way that these things can happen. And so here we go. That's what we're hearing preached. And not for very long. 3 Sabbath days. Why does Paul go to the synagogue first? Yeah. Why would that be his custom?
Jews should have had enough knowledge to understand what had happened, looking back in the prophets, the Old Testament, and understand what has happened.
Yeah.
It says he addressed them from
Yes. They should have been, like maybe the phrase that we might use is low-hanging fruit. That's what they should have been. Right? You should go in, they already believe in God, they already believe the prophets, and so you should be able to walk in and just say, hey, here's the law and the prophets, here's what they say, and here was God's plan, and somebody who was a conscientious and studious Jew should go, wow, that makes sense. I'm on board. Right? That's what should happen. That's not what happens all the time, but it should. Okay, so this Jesus I proclaim to you is the Christ, the Messiah. Now in verse 4, some of them were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas. So there were people who listened. As did a great many of the devout Greeks and not a few of the leading women. Now, very peculiar, the fact that you have the leading women mentioned. Right? In the first century, probably you don't get that mentioned very often. But here you do. Right? The New Testament, God has always emphasized that all people are people. All people are people. Some of them were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, many of the Greeks, and not a few of the leading women. And it's interesting how you have some of the Jews, but a great many of the Greeks. So the Thessalonian church is going to be mostly what? Jew or Gentile? Probably Gentile. It's probably going to be mostly Gentile. Which, in a Greek region, that's what you would expect. Right? You would expect over time the church to eventually look more like the place where it was from. Yes?
Yeah, just a minute ago you asked why Paul went to the synagogue. It's not unlike us when we're traveling. We'll find a church to go to. And now the difference is Paul went specifically to preach and teach. But we do see one other thing that I think is super important, and it's a great learning opportunity for all of us, because we tend to be very, these days, especially in our culture, in this heated culture, we tend to be very charged in how we approach things that we argue. But it says Paul reasoned with them, and reasoning is a back and forth. It's you listening to somebody and then them listening to you. So it's a reasoning, and as a result, we see that some people were converted, some people were joined Paul and Silas.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point. And it allows, part of that reasoning process is allowing people to ask questions, to question what you're saying, to say, I don't believe you, prove it. Like, okay, well, let's talk about it. Right? Yeah, you're exactly right.
I suggest that he went to the synagogue because that's where the people were. And he went on the Sabbath because that's when they were there.
Yeah. Yeah. He's going to go when he can talk to people who are very likely already going to believe with the foundations that will move them to Jesus. Absolutely.
We know Paul made it his plan. His purpose or his plan was to go to the Jews first and then to the Greeks.
Yeah.
So, same way of doing it.
And frankly, if I was going to preach and I were traveling around the world doing it, and I was going to places where there were communities of U.S. citizens, I would preach to the U.S. citizens first and then go talk to other people. Why? Is it because I think the U.S. citizens are better? No.
They have all the relationships.
And I can connect to them, and then they should have the relationships out in the community. What was that? Yeah. I have more in common, most likely, I have more in common with U.S. service people stationed in Guam than I would with people from that area, right? Or in the Philippines. In fact, I don't even know how to speak many of the Pacific languages, so my hope is that I could go to some facility or place where I could meet people where we spoke the same language, and then maybe instruct them, and then they could go out and teach. And so that's sort of what you're seeing. It is a fulfillment of prophecy, but it's also just really a matter of practicality. Right? He's going to go, he's not planning on spending 30 years in Thessalonica. So he goes to people who he's most likely able to influence, And then if he has opportunity, he'll speak to others. But the goal is to establish a church and then let the church do the work in the region. And so that's what we see. Because Paul can't do it all by himself. So there are some people who are persuaded. They'll join. But the Jews in verse 5 were jealous, and taking some wicked men of the rabble, they formed a mob, and they set the city in an uproar, and they attacked the house of Jason, seeking to bring them out. And when they couldn't find him, they'd find Paul. They dragged Jason and some of the other brothers before the city authorities, shouting, "These men who have turned the world upside down have come here also." And now, that's an accusation. They're upsetting the Roman order, right? Rome has been working really hard to set the world aright, and these people are pulling the dressing off the table, so to speak. Jason has received them, and they're all acting against the decrees of Caesar, saying there is another king, Jesus. That's not a minor accusation. They're treason. They're treasonous. They are turncoats. They are subversives. They are any word that you would use to talk about somebody who is actively working against your empire. In the mid-1900s, if you were brought before a congressional hearing and somebody said that you were a communist, was that a good or a bad thing? Bad. You could be killed for it. Right? So, same idea, but 2,000 years ago. Same idea. They're claiming that there's some other leader, Jesus. And the people and the city authorities are disturbed when they heard these things. And when they had taken money as security from Jason and the rest, see, bail, always a thing, they let them go. The fact that Jason is able to pay security and isn't just executed or thrown into jail on the spot sort of indicates that he was either a person of standing in the city or he may have been a citizen himself. We don't know. But here the idea, the people and the city authorities are disturbed when they heard these things. Why? Why would it upset them to hear that there's this group preaching another king? Yes. It's a threat to their power. It's a threat to their good standing with Rome. It's a threat to the way that they have built their culture and everything around it. So if it's a threat, what do you do? Yeah, you're going to eliminate it. At first, maybe in a gentle way, because really this idea of new religions popping up, it's not uncommon in this period in history. It happened all the time. That's where these mystery cults come from. They're new things that sort of pop up, and they normally rise and fall within a relatively short period of time. And so your first course of action as a leader in the city would just be like, this is illegal, don't do it. And if you do it, we're going to fine you and arrest you and maybe beat you and throw you in prison, or we'll go take care of the leaders and we'll do these things. And it's really not the fact that they are preaching another religion, but that they're preaching another king. That's the problem. That will be the point of contention. Now, they're fine with you having a religion that differs as long as you recognize the pantheon and as long as you recognize there is one king, Caesar, but coming and claiming that there is another king, that's not okay. So the brothers, in verse 10, immediately send Paul and Silas away by night to Berea, and they arrive there and they go into the Jewish synagogue. One of the things you'll notice about Paul is that he never stops. He doesn't quit. They'll even stone him, and he gets up and he goes right back into the city. It's amazing. Right? And so here he is driven out of one city, so he just goes to the next. He's treated poorly in one synagogue, so he just goes to the next. And he will keep doing this over and over and over. He's persistent, if nothing else. But he doesn't get to stay long in the city. 3 weeks, maybe a little more. Right? Some people have estimated that he is there for a few months. I don't know. We don't know how long he's there. We just see 3 weeks, and then the Jews get upset. Very shortly after that, there's a riot. How long it takes for them to get this riot together, I don't know. He's probably there not much longer than 3 weeks. And so when he writes this letter back to the people in Thessalonica, he's going to talk about feeling torn away from them. I mean, quite literally. Here he is. This mob is going to kill him. And so he is forced to leave the city. And what's interesting is the brothers have to send Paul away at night.
Sort of interesting to me. Paul's
Yes.
I don't know if this is the first instance of that, but it seems like they were really serious about it.
Yes. Yeah, they organized this mob, and they were really serious about opposing Paul. And I imagine in verse 10, try not to read things into the text, but knowing Paul's personality and just imagining this conversation, are the people in Thessalonica saying, they're going to kill you if you don't leave, and Paul saying, I don't care. And them saying, no, we're going to send you away. And Paul saying, I don't know if that's a good idea. And they're like, Paul, it's not a debate. You're leaving. That's sort of how I don't, maybe he was agreeable to it, I don't know. But regardless, he has to be sent away because he's going to die if he stays. And that's sort of the background for the letters that we're going to read. And when we get an idea then of what's going on, how the church in Thessalonica begins with a riot, that's a crazy way to begin a church. Imagine the church at Brentwood, when it was begun, if people moved here to this area and the surrounding community had a riot because there was a church here. Would you move here to be part of that? Probably, yeah. No, I've got kids. I can't be part of that. But the people in the first century, first of all, they didn't ask for the riot. Right? They're not instigators. They're not fomenting these types of actions. But when they happen, the faith and courage of brothers and sisters whose names we don't know is remarkable. The fact that there even still is a church in Thessalonica, after this very well-organized effort to stamp it out, after what it seems to be deadly threats against the teachers in the local area, the fact that there even is a church afterward speaks to the hope of the gospel and the resiliency of the faith that these people have in Jesus, which seems to be why Paul is concerned for them. That's why he's going to write these letters. They're going to have questions. It's very easy to get discouraged in the face of such violent opposition. It's easy to be discouraged in the face of not only what will be physical opposition, but also philosophical opposition. And maybe people even asking you questions trying to upset your belief. And so these believers in Thessalonica, first of all, they didn't get to listen to Paul for too terribly long. So they're probably going to have questions. Not only that, they're having to deal with persecution, both politically and socially. And they're also going to have to deal with maybe, I don't know what to call it other than philosophical persecution, right? People coming and trying to attack their faith on the idea level. Yeah, Dan.
I wonder what kind of effect it had when these Jewish leaders kind of aligned themselves with these wicked men from the rabbi. It probably didn't set a great example for their particular followers as well. Probably, possibly even, charged up these Christians to separate themselves from those people. Imagine us disagreeing with something here in the building and, going downtown and picking up some gang members and bringing them in to be the hatchet men or the
Yeah.
strong arms to get our way. It's just inconceivable.
Yeah. And the people who are reasonable would probably leave. Right? And so it's interesting how God works these things out, always to his glory, always to his benefit. There may have been some people, it's an interesting element to think of. There may have been some people who were on the fence, and then when they see the behavior of these leaders, they're like, well, at least over here they're not starting riots. I'm going to go listen to what they have to say. And so it's, if anything, a tumultuous beginning to the church in Thessalonica, and you can see that in the letters that Paul writes. His concern for their physical well-being, his concern mostly how that physical well-being affects their spiritual well-being, the strength of their faith, their willingness to learn, the questions that get raised, in particular about things like the resurrection, their questions about fulfilled prophecy that you can see in the second letter, and really this adherence, this repetition of the need to hang on to what was delivered, to whether it was by letter, whether it was by word of mouth, whether it's what the script, in Scripture, hang on to what was delivered, and we'll get more to that throughout the rest of the quarter. Thank you for your comments, for your attention. I hope that the background helps us dive into the letters and get a better feel for what's being said.